there is an accompanying work that goes along with this, Americans and the Holocaust. It's a book of documents by Daniel Green, who's one of the scholars featured in the documentary, and Edward Phillips. And what I've prepared are some supplementary materials, and I'm going to leave the supplementary materials with Marcy. And one of the supplementary materials is the timeline from this book, which is quite useful. So if you're at Beth Emmet and you see Marcy, she'll have the supplementary materials. Burns was approached by the Holocaust Museum to make the documentary, and then was supported throughout by the museum and its extraordinary archives. He began the work in 2015, completed the film in 2022. Ken Burns is quoted as saying that this is the most important documentary he has made in his long career, which is quite a statement. And I think the reason for this should emerge as we discuss the documentary. Burns worked with his longtime collaborator, writer Jeffrey Ward, as well as documentarians Lynn Novick and Sarah Botstein, and narrator Peter Coyote. To quote Burns, "We helped each other through the difficulties in making this. It was heartbreaking. It was a 7-year-long labor of love, but it was heartbreaking at the same time." Burns and several of his collaborators had prior knowledge of the period due to previous documentaries they had worked on together. They made a documentary on World War II, documentary on the Roosevelts, a documentary on American rescuers Waitstill and Martha Sharp, who saved a number of Czech Jews. And the filmmakers worked with top scholars in the fields of Holocaust studies as advisors. The valuable insights of these scholars are supplemented throughout by the judicious use of archival film footage, photographs, other materials. The filmmakers deliberately avoided the overuse of horrific footage, although there's still plenty of graphic footage in the documentary. The U.S. and the Holocaust skillfully interweaves throughout the 6 hours 2 parallel narratives in a very lucid and cogent way. The first narrative is the rise to power of Hitler and the Nazis in Germany, and then the spread of Nazi power through the German war machine and the appeasement policy of Great Britain and France, which culminated in the outbreak of World War II. And then once you had the cover of war, you also had a second war, Hitler's war against the Jews. Historian Deborah Lipstadt reminded us in the documentary that we have never replaced ourselves demographically since the Holocaust. In 1939, there were 16.5 Jews in the world. Today, there are 15 million. So we still, almost 80 years later, we still have not replaced ourselves. And part of the reason is due to the murder of 1.5 million Jewish children who were specially targeted by the Nazis. This has really proved devastating to Jewish demographic growth. The second narrative deals with the response of the American government and the American public to the rise and spread of Nazism, and then the genocidal consequences for European Jewry. It might at first appear that, given the title of the film, Burns devotes a bit too much time to the first strand, namely the Holocaust. But the horrific results of the Shoah graphically highlight the negative results of prejudice, apathy, and indifference on the part of so many in this country. One of the film's greatest strengths is the impactful use of survivor testimony. The filmmakers chose memorable survivors, thoughtfully used their testimony, and each, of course, has a great story to enhance the events under discussion. As the film goes on, one becomes more and more familiar with the survivors as their accounts personalize the unfolding tragedy of the Holocaust. One of the most memorable survivors is Guy, originally Gunther Stern, who, by the way, last year turned 100 years old, and he is just an incredible witness. Mr. Stern's testimony was especially clear in pointing out the calculated step-by-step manner by which the Nazis sought to isolate and humiliate German Jews, turning them into impoverished pariahs. Mr. Stern's testimony also shows how young German Jewish survivors who reached this country Americanized, and in Mr. Stern's case, and in other young German Jews' cases as well, enlisted in the armed forces, then returned to Europe to fight the Nazis who had persecuted them and their family. Unfortunately, Mr. Stern is the only survivor of his immediate family. His younger brother, younger sister, and parents were all murdered by the Nazis. The entire film concludes with Mr. Stern's admonition that we have to learn what we have to learn from the Shoah is a reminder of the malicious depths to which human behavior can sink, and we have to work to prevent those who exhibit such behavior from gaining power and perpetrating future crimes. But the U.S. and the Holocaust begins with the story of Anne Frank. Burns deliberately chose to do so in order to provide an often overlooked and underreported component of Anne Frank's story, namely her father's efforts to secure entrance into the United States, and how the fate of this probably best-known victim of the Shoah was influenced by American immigration policy at the time. In the words of Ken Burns, "We're not responsible for the Holocaust. We did as much as any nation to defeat its perpetrators on the battlefield and in the number of people we accepted. But we failed because we did not yell enough about it, because we did not yell early enough about it, and because, of course, we did not save nearly as many people as we could have saved. The State Department was always changing the goalposts, making it too hard for even Otto Frank, Anne's father, who had very good connections in this country, to get his visa. I think if he had gotten it, Anne Frank might very well still be alive." And obtaining a visa involved gathering a host of documents, such as paperwork involving identity, police certificate of good conduct, an exit permission, and most importantly, a financial affidavit that included an American sponsor. And that affidavit had to be for $5,000, which at the time was maybe 2 or 3 times the average salary of an American worker, annual salary, and so on. The American journalist Dorothy Thompson accurately observed that a signature on a piece of paper could make the difference between life and death. And even with such a signature, the quota system in this country could make immigration impossible. In 1939, a Hungarian Jew applying for an American visa, even with the required paperwork, would have had to have waited 42 years to get into this country, given the Hungarian quota. The ordeal of Anne Frank's family is threaded throughout the film, and it was in keeping with the goal of Burns and his collaborators. Quote, again, Ken Burns, "Despite the seeming limitation of the American lens, we sought to paint a more complete picture of the Holocaust through the what was going on as far as the American government and American public. Recent scholarship," this is also Burns, "has shown how persistently and anxiously and then desperately Otto Frank was trying to secure American visas for his family, but his efforts were thwarted by a State Department filled with nativists and anti-Semites. And chief among them was a man by the name of Breckinridge Long, a wealthy, conservative, democratic politician who headed the visa department of the visa division of the State Department following the outbreak of World War II. By the way, prior to that, Breckinridge Long, who was a friend, not necessarily a close friend, but friendly with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was for 3 years the American ambassador to Italy. And he, on several occasions, expressed his admiration for Mussolini. Once he was in this position of power in the State Department, with the visa division, Long gave priority to what he termed national security concerns, in quotes, over humanitarian imperatives. This meant rigorously screening immigrants to detect spies, but of course these concerns were greatly heightened by Long's anti-Semitism. In June 1940, Long gave orders to American consuls to, in quotes, put every obstacle in the way and require additional evidence and to resort to various administrative devices to postpone and to postpone and postpone the granting of visas. The State Department, again under Long's direction, later on blocked the transfer of financial assistance from American Jewish organizations to Jews in Romania and France. And this assistance had been authorized by the Treasury Department, but Long's State Department blocked it. After July 1941, the State Department implemented additional measures to make Jewish immigration even more difficult. Then, on October the 23rd, 1941, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, which was the instrument of the final solution, forbade Jewish immigration from any territory under German control, and then that was it. European Jewry was imprisoned, even though America still was not quite in the war in October 41, all the American consulates were closed. Then one might also note that for 3 crucial months in 1942, Long's State Department, although the State Department, not only Long, but under Cordell Hull also, blocked the release of a telegram affirming the final solution from Gabriel Regner, the representative of the World Jewish Congress in Geneva, to leading American Rabbi Stephen Wise. Then as far as Long, one last point to highlight, and that is that in early 1943, the Regner telegram to Wise finally had been released at the end of November 42. So in early 43, the press, American press, the American Jewish community, the American public knew about the final solution. At that time, it was thought that 2 million Jews had been murdered. And in fact, it was double that amount. But there was pressure since the final solution had become known. And so representatives from Great Britain and the United States held in April of 43 the Bermuda Conference. This conference was supposed to do something to help the Jews of Europe, but in fact, it was a fig leaf for inaction. Breckinridge Long instructed the American delegate to the Bermuda Conference to refrain from agreeing to any meaningful action on behalf of European Jewry. And of course, Great Britain, that had issued the white paper in May of 39, white paper limited Jewish immigration to Palestine to 15,000 a year for 5 years. They were not going to, Great Britain was not going to do anything about that. The Bermuda Conference ended with no publicized rescue plan and did face American press criticism of empty posturing. One American diplomat characterized it as a facade for procrastination. The conference ended April the 30th, 1943. This was the very time when the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion was raging. Once Shmuel Zeigelbaum, who was the Bund, the Polish Jewish socialist representative in London to the Polish government in exile, learned about the results of the Bermuda Conference. He committed suicide. In the note that he left behind, he wrote, "By my death, I wish to express my strongest protest against the inactivity with which the world is looking on and permitting the extermination of the Jewish people. Where is the world's conscience? Where is the world's conscience?" Well, one scholar has termed Breckinridge Long the American Eichmann. I don't think we can go that far, but I think what we can say is that in terms of Long and his acolytes in the State Department, in the Visa Division especially, that they were desk murderers. Long's policies had congressional support. Senator Robert Reynolds of North Carolina said at the time, "If I had my way, I would today build a wall about the United States so high and so secure that not a single alien or foreign refugee from any country on the face of the earth could possibly scale or ascend it." Obviously, the Reynolds' comments ring true today, unfortunately. And there were many Americans at the time who agreed with Senator Reynolds. Isolationism had a huge amount of American support during the interwar period and even after the outbreak of the Second World War. As late as July 1941, 75% of Americans polled thought that US involvement in World War II would create another Great Depression, and a similar percentage did not want this country to enter the war. The isolationist America First Committee, headed by Charles Lindbergh, who was not only a nativist but also an anti-Semite, had numerous branches throughout the country. American corporations, such as the Ford Motor Company, had German subsidiaries that were doing profitable business with Germany and even helping the German war effort. Henry Ford himself was a virulent anti-Semite who had been awarded a medal by the Nazis. Ken Burns explained the heartbreak he experienced working on the US and the Holocaust this way, quote, "During the Second World War, millions of Americans fought and sacrificed to defeat fascism. But even after we began to understand the scope and the scale of what was happening to the Jewish people of Europe, our response was inadequate, deeply flawed. We deliberately chose the title, the U.S. and the Holocaust, U period, S period, and the Holocaust, because it is about the U period, S period, the United States response to the Holocaust. It's about us, U.S., us, and the Holocaust. Because it is so easy to blame bold-faced names, the FDRs or the pernicious anti-Semitism that existed in the State Department, but it's the American people who made war rescue impossible. If we, continuing with Burns, consider ourselves to be an exceptional country, we have to be tough on ourselves and hold ourselves to the highest standards. We cannot sanitize our history into a feel-good story, which I would, of course, we know there are several politicians, including most notably the governor of Florida, are trying to do. but rather we have to deal with the racism, nativism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant sentiment that have existed throughout our history. And then going back to Burns, quoting him, "We like to see ourselves as good people and a nation of immigrants welcoming others, but in fact, we have been welcoming as well as unwelcoming. The exclusion of people and shutting them out has been as American as apple pie. The American people wanted the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act. Its aim was to curb the immigration of so-called racial undesirables. This act remained in place until 1965 and choked off immigration. The American people wanted the golden door shut. The American people did not want to admit more Jewish refugees, even after Kristallnacht. The American people did not want to admit 20,000 Jewish children under the Wagner-Rogers Act of early 1939. This act actually was never voted on, never came to the floor. The proposal was to admit 10,000 Jewish children or refugee children. They didn't use the word Jewish. 10,000 children in 39, 10,000 in 1940, total of 20,000. Eleanor Roosevelt supported the act. So did their liberal congressmen, especially Emanuel Sellers. It was never brought to the floor because the fear was that had it been brought to the floor, that immigration would have been choked off altogether for once the war was underway for anybody in Europe. So it was never brought to the floor. The bitter irony is that in 1940, this country accepted 10,000 children from the UK who the Blitz was going on, and so they came to this country for temporary shelter. Not one of these children was Jewish. Then, of course, in addition, in 1939, the US government refused to admit to some 900 Jewish refugees on the German ocean liner St. Louis, sending them all back to Europe, where more of a quarter of the passengers were eventually killed in the Holocaust. Anti-immigrant sentiment among the American population was buttressed by economic insecurity and also ethnic tensions due to the Great Depression. The Depression had, given the New Deal policies of Roosevelt, had abated to some extent after 1933, after his election. But in 37, 38, there was a deep recession in this country. With the unemployment here increased to close to 20%. Americans were fearful that immigrants would take their jobs or increase the need for government relief. In addition to this, between 1933 and 41 in this country, there were some 100 new anti-Semitic organizations founded, including Father Charles Coughlin's National Front for Social Justice, William Paley's Silver Shirts, and the German-American Bund headed by Fritz Kuhn. There was a consistent anti-Semitic undercurrent in the speeches of American aviation hero Charles Lindbergh and in the America First Committee that he came to head. Polling showed that more than half of Americans placed some or all of the blame for Nazi oppression of the Jews on the Jewish victims themselves. In fact, of course, we know the ideological blame for Nazi anti-Semitic persecution may be ascribed to so-called racial science that divided human beings into artificial categories based on a so-called racial hierarchy, dividing races into superior and inferior. And this Nazi racial anti-Semitism was buttressed or underlaid by centuries of Christian anti-Semitism that condemned the Jews as deicides, as obsessed with money and material goods, as greedy and deceitful, parasitic, egotistic, and willfully blind to religious truth, and most damning of all, as conniving agents of the devil, the father of all lies. All of this helped the Nazis in their efforts for seeing the Jews as the, in quotes, other, the evil them versus the noble us. And the ideological blame for the Shoah, of course, also rests with the science, in quotes, of eugenics in vogue in the early decades of the 20th century, which divided human beings into so-called productive and non-productive hierarchical categories and justified prejudice and discrimination against inferior human beings. Both of these pseudosciences, racism, eugenics, were popular among certain segments of the American population at the time, and were translated into Jim Crow laws and to sterilization laws. Over 60,000 women were involuntarily sterilized in this country. That presented these Jim Crow laws, the American sterilization, served as examples for the Nazis. Hitler also viewed the American conquest of the territories comprising the United States and the indigenous people in them as a model for Lebensraum, for the living space that the so-called master race needed to conquer in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. We, Hitler, the United States conquered their West, we are going to conquer our East. It's important to note, however, that insofar as the Holocaust is concerned, the United States could not have stopped the genocide against European Jewry, whose annihilation phase began with the German invasion of the Soviet Union on July the 22nd, 1941. This was the so-called Holocaust by bullets that murdered 1.5 million Jews in the Soviet Union. The most significant event in this Holocaust by bullets was in Babi Yar ravine outside the city of Kiev on September 29th, 30th, Yom Kippur, 1941. Einsatzkommando 4A murdered 33,771 Jews at this horrific site. The Roosevelt administration did everything possible to fight American isolationism, strongly supported Great Britain in 1940, when after the fall of France, it stood alone as the only major European power fighting Nazi Germany. The United States was then a neutral country. We did not enter World War II until Pearl Harbor, and then 4 days after Pearl Harbor, December 11th, 1941, Adolf Hitler actually declared war on us. We didn't have to declare war on Germany. He declared war. He and Mussolini declared war on us in support of their ally, Japan. By this time, by the time that America entered the war, more than 1 million Jews had already been murdered. 1942 was the year during which the greatest mass murders of Jews occurred. The Wannsee Conference of Nazi officials who would coordinate the mass murder was held January the 20th, 1942. Subsequent months saw the building and operation of the so-called Operation Reinhard camps in Poland, Belzec, Treblinka, Sobibor. Already Chelmno was up and operating, where murder took place through gas van asphyxiation. Then Auschwitz-Birkenau, Majdanek accelerated their killing operations in 1942. But for the United States and its allies, 1942 was a year when the outcome of World War II hung in the balance. Japan had advanced in the Pacific to threaten Australia. Germany and Italy were driving through North Africa towards Egypt and towards Palestine and threatening the Jews there. The Germans were conquering large swaths of territory in the Soviet Union on their way to Stalingrad. American troops did not land in North Africa until late November 1942. By the end of 42, as mentioned earlier, the Nazis had already murdered 4 million Jews. The Allies did not land in Sicily until July 1943, did not land in France to open the long-awaited Second Front in Hitler's so-called Fortress Europa until June the 6th, D-Day. By this time, 5 million Jews had been murdered. American troops did not liberate a major Nazi concentration camp until April 1945, at a time when approximately 6 million Jews had already died. It should also be observed that due to German military might at the time, the Soviet Union could not prevent the cold-blooded deaths through starvation and disease of more than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war by the Nazis. Of course, this does not mean that the United States could not have done more to save European Jewry. First, obviously, by increasing immigration quotas, although we did admit anywhere, we don't know the exact figure, 180,000 to 225,000 Jews in flight from Nazi persecution. But we could certainly have done more to pressure our British and Soviet allies to save Jews. We could have done a lot more to work with neutral countries to rescue Jews. And we could have done a lot more to publicize on a governmental level the genocidal crimes of the Nazis. So I just want to conclude with what I believe are some significant lessons that the viewer of the US and the Holocaust can take from the film. First is the pernicious, lethal power of anti-Semitism, a mutating, destructive virus that has been with us for centuries, the longest hatred. Nazi anti-Semitism gave rise to the murder of millions of Jews, but the anti-Semitism in the State Department and the anti-Semitism among the American people helped to doom tens of thousands who could have been saved. Ken Burns stated, "What is so urgent about the story that we are telling is that while it is a timeless story, it resonates with the current period. One reason why the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924 was so successful was this fear by the Protestant, white, nationalist majority in this country that it was going to be replaced. And of course, in Charlottesville, we heard the Jews will not replace us. The Jews, the so-called puppeteers behind the puppets that they're bringing into this country will not replace us." And then Burns's words, "This seems to be an echo from the past talking to our present, or an echo of our present talking to our past." Possible second lesson, as Ken Burns and his team continued to work on the film, the more they were astonished by the current misinformation and disinformation they encountered about the Shoah. And of course, we have heard gun control laws, mask mandates during the pandemic equated with Nazi anti-Jewish legislation, abortion equated with genocide against the Jews. Author Daniel Mendelsohn, who's one of the scholars in the film, scholarly voices in the film, also noted the incorrect idea that most of the Jews in the Shoah died in the same way, in other words, through poison gas. While half of those murdered in the Holocaust did die through gassing, hundreds of thousands of Jews died in the Holocaust by bullets. Hundreds of thousands of Jews died in Nazi slave labor camps, and prisons. It's mind-boggling to think that research done by the United States Holocaust Museum has uncovered the fact that the Nazis built some 44,000 camps, prisons, slave labor camps, transit camps, satellites of major concentration camps, a veritable kingdom of death. So hundreds of thousands died in that way. Hundreds of thousands also died in ghettos and a variety of other ways. A third lesson, we are still living, unfortunately, in a genocidal world. It is still difficult to believe, even now, not just the extent of the Shoah and the Armenian genocide that preceded it, but the fact that genocides are still occurring in this world. You might, if you saw I believe it's part 3 of the film, there's a portion, an episode, where Jan Karski, who is a Polish envoy sent by the Polish government in exile, comes to the United States to inform people in 1943 about what is happening to the Jews of Europe. He meets with Roosevelt. Roosevelt nods and listens and says, we're going to do everything we can to win the war, and that way we'll save the Jews. And then he goes to Felix Frankfurter, who is a Jewish American Supreme Court justice, and Karski tells him what firsthand Karski had seen, because he saw what was happening in Belzec in eastern Poland. And after hearing Karski's account, Frankfurter said, I don't believe you. I don't believe you. Karski was accompanied by a representative of the Polish government in exile who indignantly said, Mr. Justice, are you accusing Mr. Karski of lying? No, Frankfurter replied, I am just saying I cannot believe what he said. We know what was previously unimaginable is imaginable, but it still, in many ways, is unimaginable what human beings can do. Never again, insofar as genocide is concerned, has become, since the Shoah, never again. Bosnia, most recently, Bosnia, Darfur, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Rohingya, the Yazidis, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans. Well, Ken Burns observed that for a time in the 1920s, Berlin, the capital of the Democratic Weimar Republic, was the most thriving artistic and cultural center of creativity in Europe until it wasn't. And a third lesson from the film is the fragility of democracy. Of course, we know our democracy is under threat. A 2022 Axios poll showed that 1/3 of Americans would prefer rule by a strong, unelected leader over rule by a weak, elected leader. And it's obvious that there are millions of people in this country who are ready to see the perceived strong leader come to power by any means necessary. There is nothing inevitable about the survival of American democracy. And then another lesson, we turn again to Daniel Mendelsohn, who affirms that what the Holocaust demonstrates, in his words, and I'm sorry to be down and pessimistic, and to another sad lesson, is the fragility of civilized behavior. Mendelsohn said, I look at the perpetrators in sepia photographs. They're no different from us. You look at your neighbors, the people at the dry cleaner, the people at the restaurant. That's who these perpetrators were. Don't kid yourself. Lest you doubt Mendelssohn's conclusion, if you look at the Milgram experiments on obedience, take a look at the classic work by Christopher Browning on German perpetrators entitled Ordinary Men. It's a sad commentary on the human potential for evil. A sixth lesson, the film amply demonstrates the truth of Elie Wiesel's famous quote that the opposite of love is not hate, the opposite of love is indifference. It was indifference nourished by narrow self-interest, bigotry, lack of compassion, not only in America, but also elsewhere, that helped doom European Jewry. And one of the clearest examples of this was the July 1932 Evian-les-Bains conference. This was a conference that was called actually by President Roosevelt of 32 nations in July of 32, after Hitler had annexed Austria, and there were now 200,000 more Jews who were being persecuted. And so Roosevelt, his initiative, called this conference at Evian-les-Bains. And the delegates of 32 nations came, and it was supposed to address the refugee problem, even though Roosevelt had said that no nation was expected to change its quota laws. So it almost doomed the conference from the start. And delegate after delegate stood up at Evian. By the way, this was in southeastern France, near the Alps. There was summer skiing that some of the delegates went to at a place called Chamonix. And delegate after delegate said, we're not going to do anything about Jewish refugees. We're not changing our immigration policies. Only the tiny Dominican Republic agreed to take in a substantial amount of Jewish immigrants. Well, the consequence of this conference, not only for persecuted European Jewry, but for the Nazis, was quite heavy and quite dramatic. The Danziger Vorstätten, a Nazi newspaper, summed up the Nazi reaction to the Evian conference. The Evian conference serves to justify Germany's policy against Jewry. Who wants them? 4 months after Evian, on November the 22nd, 1938, this was just after Kristallnacht, the official newspaper of the Gestapo wrote, because it is necessary, because we no longer hear the world screeching, and because, after all, no power on earth can hinder us, we will now bring the Jewish question to its totalitarian solution. Historian Deborah Lipstadt, who's prominently featured in the Burns film, noted that the time to stop a genocide is before it happens. A chief pedagogical goal of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center is to impress on those students who attended not to be a bystander, but rather seek to be an upstander. Then another lesson we learned from the survivor testimony in the film, the story of Anne Frank and her family, is the importance of viewing the Holocaust on an individual basis as the loss of 6 million individual precious lives. In the words of author Judith Miller, abstraction is memory's most ardent enemy. It kills memory because it encourages distance and often indifference. We must remind ourselves that the Holocaust was not 6 million. It was 1 + 1 + 1. Only in understanding that civilized people must defend the one, by the one, by the one, can the Holocaust be given meaning. Indeed, the Holocaust must be viewed not as the murder of 6 million Jews, but rather as the murder of one Jew 6 million times. Combination 8th and 9th lessons. From the catastrophe of the Shoah, the American Jewish community learned that outside and inside pressure could produce results. Public pressure and determined publicity combined with political and moral pressure from within the Roosevelt administration helped to lead to the establishment of the War Refugee Board in early 1944. The American Jewish community also learned that the need to speak with a clear, unified voice to those in positions of power. Between 1933 and 1944, there were 4 different attempts on the part of major Jewish organizations in this country to unify and speak with one voice. It temporarily, a few months, they formed this conference or that, but it fell apart. One of the reasons was over the question of Zionism and over the question of whether or not to put the emphasis on Palestine as the key, or to find any refuge possible, or the question of whether Jews were religion or an ethnicity. After the Holocaust and after seeing what happened, there was unity. In the wake of the Holocaust, the American Jewish organizations finally united around the Zionist idea that Jews needed a state of their own to secure their safety, provide a refuge and haven to Jews in peril, and they worked assiduously for the establishment of the state of Israel. And then later, in the 70s and the 80s, together in the struggle for Soviet Jewry, not to repeat the disunity and the personality clashes that had prevented American Jewry with speaking with one voice. And finally, Sarah Botstein, one of the filmmakers, wrote, "We hope that viewers will have conversations after seeing our film about their role in a democratic society and their responsibilities to their fellow human beings as citizens of the world. We hope that viewers of our film will think about what they need to do when things get hard and complicated." The film illustrates that there were those in this country that did try to fulfill their obligations to their fellow human beings during the Shoah, and who could serve as moral exemplars in this regard. There were courageous individuals such as Varian Fry, Hiram Bingham, the Sharps, who saved Jewish lives. There were Jewish organizations, American Jewish organizations such as the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, that worked to help European Jewry. There were Christian organizations such as the American Friends Service Committee that did as well. There were a number of responsible journalists and newspaper publishers, not the New York Times, I might add, for quite some time, who were determined to keep the American public informed of Nazi atrocities. Due to public pressure, encouraged by the ardent efforts of Peter Bergson and his Emergency Rescue Committee, congressional involvement, and the dedicated efforts of the Treasury Department, finally, President Roosevelt issued an executive order on January 22nd, 1944, to establish the War Refugee Board just mentioned. The War Refugee Board, even though it was established late, did save tens of thousands of Jewish lives through the efforts of diplomats funded by the board, like Raoul Wallenberg, Karl Lutz, in Hungary and in Romania. And finally, the United States joined with allied nations in issuing the United Nations Declaration of December the 17th, 1942. And this declaration read in part, The signatories condemn in the strongest possible terms this bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination, referring to Nazi genocide. They reaffirm their solemn resolution to ensure that those responsible for these crimes shall not escape retribution, and to press on with the necessary practical measures, of course that didn't happen, towards this end. But after the war, this declaration did help to lay the foundation for the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal that put on trial major Nazi war criminals, and then in 11 subsequent trials, other Nazi perpetrators. The Nuremberg helped to lay the foundations for the International Criminal Court, which continues to prosecute war criminals and which strives to create a world in which the dignity and the rights of the individual are the center of human moral behavior and human moral vision. So I will end there.
Can't hear me. So
Okay.
if you want to go invite some questions.
Okay, sure. So please, yes, any questions, comments?
I should use.
Yes, yes.
Well, two things. One, the initial part of the exhibit at the Holocaust Museum was written by Daniel Green, who is right here from Northwestern. And I did see the exhibit in 2018 when it had just opened. But the second thing that I wanted to say is that in 2019, I went on a Danube cruise. It was a Jewish cruise from Budapest to, then we went up to Prague. And the scholar in residence on our trip was Eva Schloss, who was the young woman from Vienna, who with her brother and her parents had gone to the Netherlands. So when I saw it in the film, I thought, I know her because I spent a long time with a wonderful woman who lives in London. And it was great to see her on that film and talking. But one other thing, I'm so concerned about all the anti-Semitic, white supremacist groups that are not foundering, that are alive in our country today. It is really scary. So any ideas about that?
Other than being scared.
Well,
yes. No, it is horribly frightening, and we, and as Ken Burns said, an echo from the past to the present, and the present to the past. And of course, they
can't hear you.
That as Ken Burns said, and it's an echo of from the present to the past, and the past to the present, and it is more than concerning. And in order to, in terms of suggestions, I mean, supporting the Anti-Defamation League, other Jewish defense organizations, which one thing we can take heart, an organization such as the Anti-Defamation League, much stronger than what it was back then. Back then, the American Jewish Committee, founded by German Jews, really was not supportive at all of the Zionist cause. Today, the American Jewish Committee is out in front of fighting anti-Semitism and supporting Israel. Organizationally, American Jewry is much stronger, and at least we can take heart in that. Any other? Jerry, yes.
Good evening, Elliot. Thank you so much. Among the many facts, insights, and lessons that you shared with us tonight, I found most intriguing the comment at the very beginning where you said Ken Burns considered this to be the most important of his works. And given the body of works of Ken Burns on so many important subjects and how much quality they have and how much information they have, I'm wondering what it was or what things led Ken Burns to state that this was the most important of his works. Certainly, having watched it, there wasn't any new revelations in here. It was a nice distillation of what we knew, presented in a very interesting way. Certainly the photographs were not any more shocking than we had seen in numerous documentaries. Did it add anything of significance? Did Ken Burns feel that this was a work that would have significant impact beyond all of the Shoah literature and documentaries that we've seen? I would be interested if there's any enlightenment as to what it was that caused Ken Burns to believe that this was the most important of all of his works thus far.
I think that probably the key for him was to show the fragility of democracy. And the fragility of democracy back then, because, I mean, in the 1930s, as we said, there was no, Roosevelt, in his inaugural speech, said something to the effect that we might be at the point where the chief executive has to assume broad executive powers in order to deal with the Great Depression, the crisis that we find ourselves in. And that line received tremendous applause, and Eleanor Roosevelt commented later about how frightened she was about that, the receptivity to the potential undermining of democracy that that line pointed out. So I think that Burns is definitely coming from that point, that standpoint, that the danger of the present moment that we're in, and reminding us, reminding viewers of that, as he said, Berlin was a great center of creativity and artistic freedom until it wasn't. But I think also for Burns, just the fact that going back to what he was saying about why he entitled the film "The U.S. and the Holocaust," it's about us, and it's not about Donald Trump. It's about the millions and millions of people who support Donald Trump and others like him. It is about us, and throwing the responsibility back. Then, it was as Burns was, as the film points out, if the American people had not been as unwelcoming, as isolationist and xenophobic, et cetera. I mean, even, this is amazing, that in December of 1945, even after the public had seen newsreel footage of the camps, and even after the 6 million figure had been, become more accepted, a commonplace, that only 5% of those polled said that we should accept more refugees from Europe. 37% said, okay, we'll take the same under the quota system. Only 5% said we should take more. And of course, the rest said we should take less. I mean, it's mind-boggling. So I guess it reminds you of the power of dark emotions in the human psyche. And again, what Daniel Mendelsohn was saying about, the fragility of civilization, and what Freud saying civilization is a thin veneer in a sea of barbarism. It's, I think all that went into why he was saying this is the most important film. Riva, yes. Oh, hi.
Jewry, your question made me think about something. And I think part of Ken Burns, what he might have wanted to be doing is to educate the next generations who really don't know that much. And plus, we are an audience who, have read, have learned, have experienced all of this stuff. But even certainly non-Jews, but even among younger generations of Jews, I'm not sure how much they really know. So I was wondering if perhaps he's just, one of his goals might be education of the generations that aren't so connected to the Holocaust.
No, I think it's an excellent point, and I definitely think that he had it in mind. And this book that I mentioned, this source book, really adds to the educational value of the film, and it's very well done, and it's a very, very useful teaching tool.
Elliot, in the absence of other hands, I'm going to
Sure.
add a second comment or response. I would agree with Riva that certainly, given the apathy and amnesia of many people, including Americans, where we focus only on today and forget the past or excuse it, that would be a very important point from Ken Burns' perspective, is to continue to be a witness to each generation. Otherwise, we will forget. But I find a real sense of irony when we reflect upon your comment that this may be a lesson of how fragile democracy is, and whether you talk about the Trump administration or any type of 1933 Roosevelt thinking about the possibility of the need for a strongman. I find it ironic that a large support group of Trump, and similarly in Israel, are Jews that seem not to be fully cognizant of the risks of this elimination of democracy and this reliance upon a strongman. And that is, to me, very disturbing, that we've lost that lesson as Jews.
Definitely. And it's a real point to emphasize. Yes, given the fact that one of our political parties is enthralled to a strongman and to various sorts of fascist tendencies, and seeing what can come out of those tendencies and what a strongman, the havoc that he can wreak, and still supporting that party is difficult to comprehend. And anything? I did want to mention one point of controversy in this film, and from a historiographic.
A little louder,
A
please.
point of controversy in the film from a historiographical point of view, and that is the role of FDR. The film has been criticized by some, and this happens to be, his name is Raphael Medoff of the David Weinman Institute. He criticized the film because he felt that it was not being hard enough on FDR, and not really taking FDR enough to task about his actions or inaction. And this is a controversy, historiographical controversy, that continues to this day. And I do think that from in watching the film a second time, the filmmakers did really accentuate, and I think rightfully so, the fact that FDR, in terms of World War II, really played a decisive role in weaning this country away from isolationism and neutrality, and putting it on the side of democracy, and well, not the Soviet, but the Allied side and the UK side, let's put it this way, the anti-fascist side. And it was FDR that really helped to build up the American army, which in 1939 was the size of the army of Bulgaria. And through his efforts, FDR throughout the war made the major focus as commander-in-chief of the American war effort on Europe, on the European theater. Of course, we were fighting the Japanese throughout in the Pacific, but FDR insisted that the major goal is to defeat Hitler and to free the European continent. So there's a lot to commend him for. In terms of, in the larger sense of weaning us away from isolationism, in terms of the Jewish question, there are positives that can be said. For example, after Kristallnacht, FDR withdrew the American ambassador from Germany, condemned Hitler. He did not condemn Hitler for his crimes against the Jews. That was not, FDR and his administration stayed away from that word, the word Jews, because of the anti-Semitism in this country, because of the fact that we didn't want to be seen as fighting a war for the Jews. But there were 12,000 German and Austrian Jews in this country on temporary visas after Kristallnacht. And Roosevelt, through an executive order, let them stay. He also was responsible for persuading various Latin American countries in 38, 39, 40 to take in roughly 40,000 Jews. So, I mean, there were some definite positives. On the other hand, Roosevelt never, unlike his wife Eleanor, who was really continually advocating for that we do more for rescue, more for rescue. Roosevelt really, in terms of Jewish rescue, was always, let's win the war and then we'll rescue Jews. Of course, they had all 2/3 of European Jewry had already been killed by the end of the war. So we definitely can fault him for that. We can fault him for the fact that the State Department, this was under his administration. And there have recently come to light some, FDR did not keep a diary. And so there's, in terms of his personal thinking, there's a limited amount that we know. But recently there have been some FDR papers that have come to life about a project called Project M. This was, FDR was concerned about what would happen with surviving Jews after the war. And he tasked a commission called Project M to make certain suggestions to him about where Jews should go after the war. And in this FDR correspondence between him and the head of this Project M commission, which came to be headed by an anti-Semite, unfortunately, FDR said Jews should be spread thinly. Jews should not, we don't want Jews to be concentrated in any one particular area, like the Lower East Side of New York or Jewish neighborhoods that he saw in this country. And he also was in this correspondence, he writes in what we can only say are some racist terms. Like he talks about, what about the Northern Italian stock, the Southern German stock? Although Roosevelt really gave Jews the chance during the New Deal to enter government, and some of his closest advisors were Jews, still this patrician and old line wealth, Roosevelt, the Dutch, from Dutch ancestry, there was some of this racist and what we might term negative towards Jews thinking. So it's not a black and white proposition, just like the bombing of Auschwitz. This question, another question that historians debate: should Auschwitz have been bombed? Should not? Not easy answers to this. But I do think that the film, if you come out of the film, you probably get a more positive picture of, there's some negatives, but a more positive picture of FDR than a negative. And this was, there are certain historians that, especially more right-wing in terms of Jewish historians, who criticize the burns because of this. Any other comments or questions? Well,
wow.
Thank you.
Wow. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm going to just say thank you, and I'm going to invite you to unmute and express your appreciation. And unmute and speak.
Oh, and please remember the supplementary materials. I will leave them with Marcy. And supplementary materials, there's something on Breckinridge Long, on FDR, bombing of Auschwitz, et cetera, et cetera. So they'll be with Marcy.
What is that book, though, of
So
source
the
material?
book is called Americans and the Holocaust, Daniel Green. It's a source book for the film.
Oh,
And one other book that just might recommend, it's a fairly newly published book. It's called The Escape Artist, and by Jonathan Friedland, Freedland. And this is a book, it centers on Rudolf Verba, his original name, Rudolf Rosenberg, who was one of the 4 men to escape from Auschwitz, make his way through Slovakia, and to write a report. This is a copy of the report that the War Refugee Board got by the summer of 1944 of Auschwitz, of what was happening in Auschwitz. Verba and others had escaped from Auschwitz in order, and he and Alfred Wetzler escaped in April of 44 to try, and then 2 others escaped a little later, to try to warn Hungarian Jews of what would happen to them if they were deported to Auschwitz. And unfortunately, since 440,000 Hungarian Jews were deported between May and July of 44, and more than 330,000 were killed, they did not succeed in their goal. But they did succeed in issuing this report, the Auschwitz Protocols, it's called, that the War Refugee Board had, and was one of the reasons that the War Refugee Board wanted us, the US, to bomb Auschwitz, which didn't happen. But anyway, the book itself, The Escape Artist, it's really an excellent book. So,
Elliot,
yes.
during your presentation, I recalled several years ago when you made a similar presentation at Beth Emmet about the Albanian response to protecting Jews at risk.
Jews.
And I could not help but recall that tonight and compare it with the response or neglect or rejection within the U.S. community. I think it's a striking contrast.
It's an excellent point. Little Albania was the only country in Europe that at the end of the war had more Jews in it than it did at the beginning of the war, because Jews, I mean, we're not talking about tens of thousands, talking about in several thousands. There were, especially after the Germans occupied Italy in September of 43, there were Jews who fled to Albania, and they were welcomed by Albania. So it's an often overlooked story.
By the Muslims of Albania.
By the Muslims,
Yes.
largely Muslim, yes. Yes. And there were other European, I mean, in Bosnia, for example, there were Muslim rescuers of Jews, and North Africa as well. So that is part of the story. You know, that's a heartening part of the story.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for listening.
Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you, Elliot.
You're
Yeah,
very
it was a
welcome.
wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And
Appreciate
one
it.
of the things I noticed for myself is one of the reasons I especially appreciated your talk is because I can't watch the shows on television because of the pictures and the graphics. It's too personal to my family history, but when I hear you talk about it, it's, you know, it's important and it's easier to take in.
Yes, the graphic quality, yes, I understand. And your family, what is your, as far as the impact of the Shoah on your family?
Oh, well, on my mother's side, she had brothers that were, that lived in like, you know, Poland and Dresden, Germany, and they were sent to Siberia. And somehow they survived, but they don't talk about what they did to survive. I mean, now they've all passed, but so I imagine that they had to steal food, or they might have actually, you know, had to harm somebody. But they did, you know, they were a hardy group, all boys, and they made it out.
Well, the irony is that Stalin, notorious anti-Semite, we won't go into all of the history, but anyway, 250,000, mainly Polish Jews, survived in the Soviet Union. Some of them were actually deported after Russia occupied Eastern Poland in 1939, and they were considered bourgeois enemies of the state, but they were deported to Siberia. Others fled after the invasion of the Soviet Union by Germany, but about 250,000 Jews did survive in the Soviet Union, not through any design, not by design, but because in the initial phases of the war and then the confusion and all, they were able to flee into the Soviet interior. Well, thank you very much again.